Our today's topic is about words which can be used instead of very. Very. In fact, it is a very common word used in English. Have you ever noticed how often do you use the word very in everyday life? In today's lecture, I will teach you words you can use instead of very. It's better to replace words to be fluent in English, so let's get started. Very bad. You can use terrified instead of very bad. Very big. You can use atrocious. Atrocious instead of very big. Very hard. Very hard. You can use immense. Immense instead of very hard. Very lazy. Very lazy. You can use difficult. Difficult instead of very lazy. Very fat. Very fat. You can use indolent. Indolent instead of very fast. Very afraid. You can use terrified instead of very afraid. Terrified. Very accurate. Very accurate. You can use exact. Exact instead of very accurate. Very often. Very often. You can use frequently. Frequently instead of very often. Very smelly. Very smelly. You can use pungent. Pungent instead of very smelly. Very smooth. Very smooth. You can use sleek. Sleek instead of very smooth. Very willing. Very willing. You can use eager. Eager instead of very willing. Very long term. Very long term. You can use enduring. Enduring instead of very long term. Very nervous. Very nervous. You can use apprehensive. Apprehensive instead of very nervous. Very strong. Very strong. You can use unyielding. Unyielding instead of very strong. Very tasty. Very tasty. You can use delicious. Delicious instead of very tasty. Very tired. Very tired. You can use exhausted. Exhausted instead of very tired. Very valuable. Very valuable. You can use perilous. Perilous instead of very valuable. Very neat. Very neat. You can use immaculate. Immaculate instead of very neat. Very risky. Very risky. You can use precious. Precious instead of very risky. Very creative. Very creative. You can use innovative. Innovative. Very evil. Very evil. You can use wicked. Wicked instead of very evil. Very good. Very good. You can use excellent. Excellent instead of very good. Very light. Very light. You can use luminous. Luminous instead of very light. Very nice. Very nice. You can use kind instead of very nice. Very rich. Very rich. You can use wealthy. Wealthy instead of very nice. Very roomy. Very roomy. You can use spacious. Spacious instead of very roomy. Very smart. Very smart. You can use intelligent. Intelligent instead of very smart. Very weak. Very weak. You can use frail. Frail instead of very weak. Very eager. Very eager. You can use keen. Keen instead of very eager. Very detailed. Very detailed. You can use meticulous. Meticulous instead of very detailed. Very confused. Very confused. You can use meticulous. Meticulous instead of very confused. Very accurate. Very accurate. You can use perplexed. Perplexed instead of very accurate. Very crowded. Very crowded. You can use bustling. Bustling instead of very crowded. Very simple. Very simple. You can use basic. Basic instead of very simple. Very tall. Very tall. You can use towering. Towering instead of very tall. Very different. Very different. You can use disparate. Disparate instead of very different. Very empty. Very empty. You can use desolate. Desolate instead of very empty. Very scared. Very scared. You can use petrified. Petrified instead of very scared. Very serious. Very serious. You can use grave. Grave instead of very serious. Very well-to-do. Very well-to-do. You can use wealthy. Wealthy instead of very well-to-do. Very poor. Very poor. You can use destitute. Destitute instead of very poor. Very calm. Very calm. You can use serene. Serene instead of very calm. Very loud. Very loud. You can use deafening. Deafening instead of very loud. Very old. Very old. You can use ancient. Ancient instead of very old. Very slow. Very slow. You can use sluggish. Sluggish instead of very slow. Very sharp. Very sharp. You can use keen. Keen instead of very sharp. Very wise. Very wise. You can use sagacious. Sagacious instead of very wise. Very careful. Very careful. You can use cautious. Cautious instead of very careful. Very bright. Very bright. You can use luminous. Luminous instead of very bright. Very boring. Very boring. You can use dull. Dull instead of very boring. Very nice. Very nice. You can use kind. Kind instead of very nice. Very skinny. Very skinny. You can use skeletal. Skeletal instead of very skinny. Very necessary. Very necessary. You can use essential. Essential instead of very necessary. Very noisy. Very noisy. You can use deafening. Deafening instead of very noisy. Very dry. Very dry. You can use parched. Parched instead of very dry. Very cold. Very cold. You can use freezing. Freezing instead of very cold. Very clever. Very clever. You can use brilliant. Brilliant instead of very clever. Very stupid. Very stupid. You can use idiotic. Idiotic instead of very stupid. Very thin. Very thin. You can use gaunt. Gaunt instead of very thin. Very ugly. Very ugly. You can use hideous. Hideous instead of very ugly. Very wicked. Very wicked. You can use villainous. Villainous instead of very wicked. Very quiet. Very quiet. You can use silent. Silent instead of very quiet. Very accurate. Very accurate. You can use exact. Exact instead of very accurate. Very clean. Very clean. You can use spotless. Spotless instead of very clean. Very dear. Very dear. You can use cherished. Cherished instead of very dear. Very happy. Very happy. You can use ecstatic. Ecstatic instead of very happy. Very large. Very large. You can use huge. Huge instead of very large. Very little. Very little. You can use tiny. Tiny instead of very little. Very powerful. Very powerful. You can use compelling. Compelling instead of very powerful. Very risky. Very risky. You can use perilous instead of very risky. Perilous. Very short. Very short. You can use brief. You can use brief instead of very short. Very worried. Very worried. You can use distressed. Distressed instead of very worried. Very upset. Very upset. You can use distraught. Distraught instead of very upset. Very glad. Very glad. You can use overjoyed. Overjoyed instead of very glad. Very cute. Very cute. You can use adorable, adorable instead of very cute. Very colorful, very colorful. You can use vibrant, vibrant instead of very colorful. Very shy, very shy. You can use timid, timid instead of very shy. Very skinny, very skinny. You can use skeletal, skeletal instead of very skinny. Very dear, very dear. You can use cherished, cherished instead of very dear. Very dull, very dull. You can use tedious, tedious instead of very dull. Very painful, very painful. You can use excruciating, excruciating instead of very painful. Very shiny, very shiny. You can use gleaming, gleaming instead of very shiny. Very wise, very wise. You can use sage, sage instead of very wise. Very rainy, very rainy. You can use pouring, pouring instead of very rainy. Very competitive, very competitive. You can use cutthroat, cutthroat instead of very competitive. Very cheap, very cheap. You can use stingy, stingy instead of very cheap. Very exciting, very exciting. You can use exhilarating, exhilarating instead of very exciting. Very sleepy, very sleepy. You can use lethargic, lethargic instead of very sleepy. Very thin, very thin. You can use gaunt, gaunt instead of very thin. Very loved, very loved. You can use adored, adored instead of very loved. Very angry, very angry. You can use furious, furious instead of very angry. Very beautiful, very beautiful. You can use exquisite, exquisite instead of very beautiful. Very fast, very fast. You can use quick, quick instead of very fast. Very lively, very lively. You can use animated, animated instead of very lively. Very stupid, very stupid. You can use idiotic, idiotic instead of very stupid. And with this, our today's video is complete. Thank you for watching our video till the end. If you have any queries, do tell us in the comment section. Hit the like button if you like our video. Share our video with your friends and family. If you want the PDF of today's lecture, you can get the link from the description. And if you want us to make a lecture on topic of your choice, then tell us in the comments. We will be more than honored to fulfill your demands.